It is November 1945. Deep in the plains of Kansas, behind the barbed wire of Camp Concordia, hundreds of German Wehrmacht veterans, men hardened by years of brutal combat in Europe, suddenly refuse to eat or follow military orders. But this is not a violent rebellion. It is not a coordinated uprising, and it is certainly not a breakout attempt. These prisoners are staging a desperate, non-violent strike against their American captors for a completely unexpected reason. They have just received their official orders to go home. Why would an entire demographic of enemy soldiers fight a determined battle not to escape captivity, but to remain inside it? The story of this forgotten strike entirely flips our traditional understanding of wartime captivity. In almost every major conflict in human history, the end of hostilities brings a singular, universal relief, the promise of finally returning to your family. Yet, across the American Midwest, the exact opposite was unfolding. By investigating official military records and internal camp correspondence, we uncover a hidden logistical and moral crisis that erupted just as the guns fell silent in Europe. This was not an isolated panic involving a few anxious individuals. It was a sprawling phenomenon among defeated soldiers who looked across the Atlantic and saw only terror. We have to ask why hundreds of thousands of men who had once willingly marched into the brutal campaigns of the Third Reich now viewed a standard repatriation order as a literal death sentence. What exactly were they so afraid of waiting for them in the ruins of Europe? And why could the United States, despite possessing vast resources and endless open land, simply not grant them asylum? To understand this profound psychological shift, we first have to examine the staggering, almost impossible reality the American government woke up to in the closing months of 1945. By late 1945, the United States military found itself managing an unprecedented demographic anomaly right in the middle of the American heartland. Housed across 46 states in a sprawling network of more than 500 base and branch installations, the War Department was holding approximately 370,000 German prisoners of war. This was not a small, isolated contingent of high-value targets. This was the equivalent of a major American city, entirely populated by former enemy combatants, deeply entrenched within the domestic borders of the United States. To comprehend how such a massive foreign military presence came to reside in places like the rural plains of Kansas, we have to look at the severe logistical pressures of the previous 2 years. Following the Allied victories in North Africa in 1943 and the subsequent breakout in Normandy in 1944, the United States Army captured hundreds of thousands of Axis troops. Feeding, housing, and guarding this astronomical number of prisoners in the devastated theaters of Europe or the deserts of North Africa was logistically impossible. It would have drained vital supplies away from the front lines. The solution drafted by military planners was highly pragmatic. The massive fleet of Liberty ships, which had crossed the Atlantic laden with troops, tanks, and ammunition, were returning to American ports completely empty. The War Department simply repurposed these returning vessels to transport the captured soldiers back to the United States. Once these men arrived on American soil, they collided with another severe domestic crisis. The United States war machine had drafted over 12 million American men into uniform. This staggering mobilization had severely depleted the domestic civilian workforce, particularly in the agricultural sector. Across the Midwest, crops were literally rotting in the fields because there were no hands left to harvest them. The War Manpower Commission faced a catastrophic food shortage. To avert an economic and agricultural disaster, the federal government authorized the extensive integration of German prisoners of war into the local labor force. Under the strict regulations of the 1929 Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be compelled to work for the detaining power, provided the labor was not directly related to war operations, was not dangerous, and was fairly compensated. Soon, across the agricultural belt, thousands of German soldiers were dispatched from main installations like Camp Concordia to work on local farms, in canneries, and in packing plants. They harvested wheat in Kansas, picked corn in Nebraska, and processed sugar beets in Colorado. They were paid the standard rate of 80 cents a day in canteen scrip. Over the course of 2 years, this arrangement became deeply normalized. The German prisoners became an essential, highly visible pillar of the Midwestern wartime economy. Despite the barbed wire and the armed guards, a strange, quiet equilibrium had settled over these rural communities. But with the formal capitulation of the Third Reich in May 1945 and the subsequent surrender of Japan that September, that equilibrium immediately shattered. The war was officially over, and with the cessation of hostilities came a massive, inflexible legal obligation. The United States was a strict signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Article 75 of that treaty explicitly mandated that the repatriation of prisoners shall be effected with the least possible delay after the conclusion of peace. The United States government was legally bound by international law to send these 370,000 men back to Europe. It was not a suggestion, it was a binding treaty requirement. Furthermore, there was absolutely no domestic political appetite or legal framework to allow these men to stay. As the American military began the monumental task of demobilizing its own armed forces, millions of returning American GIs were going to need jobs. The Truman administration and the United States Congress were acutely aware of public sentiment. The American public had endured years of rationing, loss, and sacrifice. The idea of granting mass asylum or offering a path to citizenship for hundreds of thousands of soldiers from a recently defeated, profoundly hostile enemy nation was politically radioactive. There was no immigration loophole, no humanitarian visa, and no executive willingness to bend the rules. Their departure was an absolute, non-negotiable federal mandate. For the War Department, and specifically for the Office of the Provost Marshal General, which oversaw the POW program, this presented a staggering logistical headache. Reversing the flow of 370,000 men required meticulously coordinated train schedules from the Midwest to East Coast staging areas, such as Camp Shanks in New York, and the securement of massive shipping tonnage to carry them across the Atlantic. Planners in Washington immediately began drafting the comprehensive departure manifests. They issued strict directives to camp commanders across the country, detailing exactly when and how the installations would be liquidated. To the logistics officers mapping out the operation in the Pentagon, fulfilling the Geneva Convention was simply a matter of administration. It was a complex but entirely predictable exercise in mass transit. They assumed the prisoners, having spent years complying with work details and camp routines, would simply pack their duffel bags, board the trains, and accept their transport home. The military bureaucracy believed the execution of these orders would be a straightforward logistical exercise, but the reality brewing inside the barracks was about to shatter that illusion entirely. The illusion of a seamless departure vanished the moment the official repatriation schedules were pinned to the wooden bulletin boards inside the compounds of Camp Concordia. To the American guards, these typewritten manifests were simply the final administrative step of the war. To the German prisoners gathering around them, they were a death sentence. The sudden, visceral panic that swept through the barracks was not born of mere anxiety. It was rooted in the horrific intelligence filtering into the camps. For months, through strictly monitored Red Cross letters, permitted American newspapers, and newly arrived prisoners, the men in Kansas had been piecing together the grim reality of Hour Zero. The Germany they had marched out of years ago no longer existed. Their major cities were reduced to ash and pulverized masonry. The government they had sworn an oath to was entirely dismantled. But the sheer physical destruction of their homeland was only a fraction of their terror. The true source of the dread lay in the newly drawn maps of post-war Europe. A vast percentage of the prisoners held at Concordia originally hailed from eastern provinces, regions like Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia. Those territories had been entirely swallowed by the advancing Red Army. They were now firmly locked under brutal Soviet military occupation. These veterans knew exactly what the Wehrmacht had done during the brutal campaign in the East, and they harbored no illusions about the vengeance waiting for them. Returning meant a high probability of immediate arrest, transfer to Soviet authorities, and decades of forced labor in the East. Even those from the Western zones feared they would never find their displaced families in the chaotic, starving ruins of the continent. The initial response was a desperate wave of paperwork. Prisoners flooded the camp administration with meticulously written petitions. They pleaded with American chaplains, base commanders, and even the local Kansas farmers they had worked alongside, begging for any form of clemency. Men offered to be stripped of their citizenship, volunteering to work the fields without pay for the rest of their lives, if only they could remain in the American Midwest. But the War Department's orders were absolute. Every single petition was categorically denied. The scheduled trains to the East Coast ports would depart on time. When the bureaucratic avenues collapsed, the quiet compliance that had defined the Kansas camps for 2 years abruptly ended. The men refused to board the transport trucks. The daily agricultural details stopped dead. Then, the resistance moved into the mess halls. Hundreds of veterans pushed away their trays and simply refused to consume their rations. The hunger strike had begun. The American military administration now found itself staring down an entirely unprecedented, bizarre crisis. The United States Army was heavily armed and highly trained to suppress violent uprisings, but they were fundamentally unequipped to manage a sprawling population of starving men who had collectively decided they had absolutely nothing left to lose. The first fracture in this unprecedented standoff did not occur behind the heavily guarded fences of the compound, but in the surrounding civilian communities of the American Midwest. To understand the immediate paralysis that gripped the situation, you have to look at the sprawling agricultural landscape of Kansas in the autumn of 1945. The global war had officially ended, but the harvest waited for no peace treaty. For over 2 years, the local agricultural economy had been structurally dependent on the sheer muscle of the German prisoners. When the trucks from Camp Concordia suddenly stopped rolling into the local farms, the economic impact was instantaneous and severe. Across the plains, farmers found themselves staring at fields of unharvested crops, facing imminent financial ruin. These were American civilians, many of whom had sons serving in the Pacific or buried in Europe, who now found themselves in a bizarre, deeply contradictory position. They began quietly organizing. Local agricultural boards and individual farm owners started drafting letters and petitions to their political representatives in Washington. Their argument was purely pragmatic, stripped of any political ideology. They argued that removing these highly skilled, disciplined laborers at the height of the agricultural season would cripple the local food supply. But beneath the economic arguments lay a complex web of personal dynamics. Over years of shared labor, eating lunches in the same fields and communicating in broken English and German, a quiet, unspoken familiarity had developed. The farmers realized that the men they were working alongside were not the fanatical caricatures portrayed in wartime newsreels. They were mostly conscripted farm boys, mechanics, and laborers who shared the same rural sensibilities as their American captors. The civilian population of Kansas was subtly, yet actively, lobbying the federal government to halt the deportation of enemy soldiers. But inside the perimeter of Camp Concordia, the American military command viewed the unfolding crisis through an entirely different lens. To the base commander and the armed guards patrolling the catwalks, the hunger strike was not a humanitarian tragedy. It was a severe breach of military discipline. Initially, the camp administration vastly underestimated the nature of the protest. They relied on their past experiences managing prisoner populations earlier in the war. Between 1943 and 1944, American camps frequently dealt with internal sabotage and strikes orchestrated by hardcore Nazi non-commissioned officers, usually veterans of the Africa Corps, who used intimidation and violence to maintain ideological purity inside the barracks. The commanders at Concordia automatically assumed they were dealing with a resurgence of this exact same problem. They believed the strike was a massive bluff, a final, desperate act of insubordination, coordinated by a handful of remaining Nazi hardliners trying to assert control. Working under this assumption, the military response was swift and rigidly bureaucratic. Standard disciplinary protocols were immediately enacted. Privileges were revoked. Canteen scrip was confiscated. The camp administration issued stern, official threats over the loudspeaker system, warning that anyone refusing to follow military orders would face solitary confinement and a restricted diet of bread and water. The irony of threatening a restricted diet to men who were already starving themselves was entirely lost in the rigid execution of the military manual. The American officers were confident that the protest would collapse within 48 hours. They expected the younger, weaker prisoners to break rank, sneak into the mess halls, and fracture the strike from the inside. But as the days dragged on, the mess halls remained completely empty. The steaming vats of standard-issue rations were untouched. The American commanders watched in growing bewilderment as the standard military pressure tactics completely failed to yield a single result. As the strike deepened, the initial annoyance of the camp administration rapidly morphed into deep anxiety. The officers of the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, the military intelligence branch tasked with monitoring the political climate inside the camps, began to investigate the root of the resistance. They intensified their surveillance, censoring the outgoing mail, placing informants in the barracks, and conducting intense interrogations of the perceived strike leaders. What these intelligence officers uncovered fundamentally changed the American understanding of the crisis. They documented a profound, undeniable psychological shift across the entire camp population. The rigid ideological structures that had once governed the internal hierarchy of the prisoners had collapsed completely. The men organizing the hunger strike were not the fanatic loyalists of the SS. They were older conscripts, ordinary infantrymen, and long-serving veterans who had entirely shed their allegiance to the fallen Third Reich. The intelligence reports sent back to Washington highlighted a chilling reality. These prisoners were no longer acting as defiant, arrogant soldiers trying to disrupt the American war effort. They were acting as terrified, desperate refugees. The interrogations revealed that the strike was driven by a deep, consuming paranoia of political retribution, specifically regarding the Soviet Union. A massive portion of the prisoners at Camp Concordia originally hailed from the eastern provinces of the former German Reich, places like Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia. Through the carefully monitored flow of permitted news and Red Cross communications, these men knew exactly where the new geopolitical borders had been drawn. Their hometowns no longer existed within the boundaries of a sovereign Germany. They had been absorbed into the Soviet occupation zone or handed over to Polish administration. These veterans were acutely aware of the atrocities the Wehrmacht had committed on the Eastern Front, and they harbored absolutely no illusions about the type of justice the Red Army was administering in the ruins of their homeland. The intelligence officers realized with dawning horror that the standard threat of solitary confinement in a safe, clean Kansas brig was completely meaningless to a man who firmly believed that stepping onto a repatriation train was a direct, one-way ticket to a Siberian gulag or a firing squad. When these intelligence reports reached the Pentagon, the crisis escalated from a local disciplinary issue into a severe bureaucratic paralysis. The War Department, the Office of the Provost Marshal General, and the State Department suddenly found themselves caught in an excruciating diplomatic vice. On one side of the vice was the inflexible reality of international law. The United States government could not legally grant these men asylum. Doing so would be a flagrant violation of Article 75 of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which explicitly demanded the prompt return of all prisoners upon the cessation of hostilities. But the legal constraints were only half the problem. The geopolitical stakes were astronomical. At the Yalta Conference, the Allied powers had established strict, non-negotiable agreements regarding the repatriation of citizens to their respective zones of origin. The Soviet Union was already deeply suspicious of the Western Allies, constantly watching for any sign that the Americans or the British were harboring anti-Soviet elements or violating the post-war treaties. If the United States arbitrarily decided to halt the repatriation of German soldiers, claiming they were political refugees, it would trigger a massive diplomatic incident with Moscow. It could fracture the fragile alliance just as the New World Order was being drawn, and potentially endanger thousands of American personnel still waiting to be transitioned out of Soviet-controlled territories in Eastern Europe. But on the other side of the vice was the stark, undeniable humanitarian reality unfolding on American soil. The United States military could not simply stand by and allow hundreds of men to slowly starve to death inside a federal installation. The public relations nightmare would be catastrophic. The entire American post-war narrative was built on the foundation of moral superiority, on the concept of liberation and the humane treatment of defeated enemies. If word leaked to the international press that the United States Army was presiding over a mass starvation event in the middle of the Kansas plains, it would hand a massive propaganda victory to the Soviets and destroy the carefully cultivated image of American justice. The bureaucracy froze. Memorandums circulated endlessly between departments. Legal experts scoured international treaties for loopholes. No one in Washington could formulate a viable solution that satisfied both the rigid demands of international diplomacy and the immediate crisis of hundreds of dying men. While Washington debated, the standoff at Camp Concordia reached a critical threshold. The physical toll of the prolonged hunger strike was becoming impossible to ignore. Inside the barracks, the atmosphere was grim and silent. Men were growing visibly emaciated, their energy reserves entirely depleted. Routine roll calls became dangerous as prisoners began fainting in the autumn heat. The camp medical wards, normally equipped to handle minor farm injuries and routine illnesses, were suddenly overflowing with patients suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, and the early stages of organ failure. The American camp commanders were trapped in an impossible position on the ground. They possessed the firepower and the manpower to violently suppress a riot, but martial force is entirely useless against passive resistance. You cannot point a machine gun at a man to force him to digest calories. The only alternative to breaking the strike was forced feeding, a brutal, invasive medical procedure that the camp doctors were fiercely reluctant to implement on a mass scale, citing both logistical impossibility and severe ethical violations. The American officials were forced to maintain a facade of strict discipline, upholding international law and the directives from the War Department, regardless of the local economic sympathies of the Kansas farmers or the undeniable human desperation manifesting in the hospital beds. Unable to resolve the deadlock, and with pressure mounting from Washington to clear the domestic camps and demobilize the base, the military command ultimately made a hardline decision. The repatriation schedules would not be altered. The trains to the East Coast staging areas would depart exactly on time. Orders were handed down to the guards. If the prisoners refused to walk to the transport trucks, they were to be physically carried out of the barracks and loaded onto the rail cars. The American military bureaucracy prepared to force the issue through sheer logistical momentum, operating on the institutional assumption that the prisoners were simply suffering from irrational post-war hysteria. The commanders believed that once the men were on the move, once they saw the ships and realized the inevitability of their situation, the psychological fever of the strike would break. The United States Army was confident that the terror gripping the men was largely manufactured by rumor and isolation. But as the administrative machinery of the repatriation pipeline ground into motion and the true destination coordinates of these specific prisoners were finalized in the shipping manifests, a chilling reality began to emerge. The American military had assumed the German fears were baseless, but a deeper, unclassified look at the exact mechanics of the handover process and the ruined rail yards of Europe would soon reveal that the prisoners' paralyzing paranoia was not a symptom of hysteria, but a highly accurate assessment of a grim geopolitical reality. The American military commanders coordinating the trains in Kansas believed they were simply sending defeated soldiers back to a defeated nation. But a deeper investigation into the international logistics of the repatriation reveals a heavily guarded reality. The final destination for hundreds of thousands of these men was not a demobilization center in a quiet, divided Germany. The United States was not sending them home to their families. It was transferring them into a newly formed, internationally sanctioned pipeline of forced labor. As the war in Europe ended, the devastated Allied nations faced a continent in ruins. France and Britain lacked the able-bodied manpower required to rebuild their shattered infrastructure or extract the coal necessary to survive the impending winter. To solve this catastrophic shortage, agreements were struck at the highest diplomatic levels. The United States, holding the largest surplus of captured German personnel, agreed to turn over massive numbers of its prisoners directly into the custody of the French and British governments as human reparations. For the men starving themselves at Camp Concordia, the terrifying rumors filtering through the wire were entirely accurate. They were not going to be released. Handover to the European allies meant being deployed into some of the most lethal environments on Earth. These veterans were slated to be marched into the coastal zones and borderlands to manually clear millions of unexploded landmines, a task carrying horrific casualty rates. Others were destined for the suffocating conditions of European coal mines, locked in a brutal new captivity that could last for years before they ever saw their families again. Their worst fears were justified. Their scheduled repatriation was a direct transfer into deadly servitude. But the War Department was inextricably bound by the diplomatic machinery forged by the Allied powers. The international agreements were signed, the labor quotas were set, and the transport ships were already waiting at the East Coast harbors to carry the manpower required to rebuild a broken continent. The United States had a rigid international obligation to deliver these men, which meant the paralyzing standoff in the Midwest could no longer be ignored. The American military had to finally break the strike. The directive from the War Department arrived with absolute finality. The international shipping schedules at the East Coast ports were firmly locked, and the United States Army was ordered to clear Camp Concordia immediately. There would be no further negotiations, no more reviews of civilian petitions, and no waiting for the prisoners to voluntarily abandon their fast. The command from Washington was strictly operational. Execute the departure manifests by physical force, if necessary. Before sunrise, the atmosphere inside the Kansas compound shifted abruptly from a static stalemate to an overwhelming display of military mobilization. Heavily armed military police units, wearing steel helmets and carrying standard-issue batons and sidearms, systematically surrounded the main barracks. They were backed by the full, crushing logistical weight of the American military apparatus. Dozens of transport trucks idled in long, unbroken lines outside the main gates. This immense scale of mobilization was designed to send a singular, undeniable message. The bureaucratic machinery of a victorious nation was moving forward, and it could no longer be stalled by passive resistance. When the American guards finally breached the doors of the wooden barracks, they did not encounter a fanatical, organized enemy preparing to fight. They found hundreds of severely emaciated, exhausted men lying silently on their bunks, physically hollowed out by days of voluntary starvation. The camp officers stepped inside and issued the final, non-negotiable command to move out. For a few agonizing minutes, the standoff hung heavily in the air, but as the military police began their synchronized advance down the narrow aisles, the sheer futility of the strike became apparent. There were no chaotic brawls, no attempts to seize weapons, and no heroic last stands. The unprecedented rebellion ended in a tense, devastating silence. These veterans were simply too weak to physically resist the cold, methodical enforcement of state power. The American guards did not need to fire a single shot. They moved systematically from bed to bed, marching the compliant men out the doors and physically carrying those who could no longer stand on their own. It was a grim, mechanical processing of desperate individuals. Under heavy guard, a slow procession of defeated men was funneled into the waiting transport trucks. The elaborate network of defiance and the agonizing days of hunger dissolved into the strict, unforgiving rhythm of a federal timetable. The trucks rapidly shuttled the prisoners to the local railhead, where long lines of passenger cars sat waiting on the tracks. Guided by soldiers with submachine guns posted at every doorway, the prisoners were loaded onto the trains. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, locking them inside. With a heavy jolt of the locomotive, the transport trains slowly pulled out of the station. The men of Camp Concordia were finally moving eastward, carried relentlessly across the Kansas plains toward the exact nightmare they had just starved themselves to avoid. As the trains rolled eastward out of the American Midwest, the men of Camp Concordia were transported directly into the devastated, politically fractured Europe they had desperately tried to escape. Their departure strips away the simplistic, triumphant myths that usually define the end of the Second World War. We are conditioned to view the cessation of hostilities as a clean resolution, but the strike in Kansas exposes how the rigid laws of war violently collide with the tragic human aftermath of a global conflict. The American government was not acting out of malice. The War Department executed the immense logistical machinery it was legally bound to enforce under international treaty. The United States did what a sovereign nation had to do. Conversely, the German prisoners, stripped of their agency, suffered what they historically had to suffer as the defeated remnants of a catastrophic war. It is a profound irony. These men had survived the brutal battlefields of the deadliest conflict in human history, only to become completely helpless pawns in its administrative aftermath. They were no longer combatants. They were geopolitical currency, shipped across the Atlantic to pay the grueling labor debts of a ruined continent. For the men locked inside those departing rail cars, the ordeal was far from over. Many would spend years surviving European labor camps, clearing minefields, or enduring the harsh realities of Soviet occupation. Yet, the agricultural communities of the American heartland had left a permanent mark. Decades later, after surviving the brutal post-war reconstruction of Europe, a surprising number of these exact same veterans would navigate the immigration channels of the Cold War. They would cross the Atlantic one last time, returning to the very same Kansas towns where they had once been held, arriving not as captive enemies, but as legal American immigrants. That eventual return to the Kansas plains only deepens the strange legacy of this forgotten strike. In a global conflict defined by massive armies fighting across ruined continents, this quiet standoff fundamentally challenges how we understand the nature of captivity and the sudden terror of peace. For these German veterans, the ultimate irony of the Second World War was that after years of surviving the deadliest combat in human history, their final and most desperate battle was not fought against the armed might of the American military. It was fought against the undeniable reality that they were being forced to leave it.